I was listening to a pastor preach a word on YouTube the other day, and one sentence that he said really struck me, and that was, "The people need to hear what God has given you." And at that moment, I realized I hadn't shared my testimony in a while, and I hadn't really shared it much. So I believe that's what I need to do. I need to share my testimony. I'm going to share a part of it. My family went to church growing up, and I only went because I was forced to. So as soon as I could, I left the church. I didn't go with my family. I remember shortly after I started college, I met a girl and began this relationship with her. One night in particular, I recall having an argument with my dad. I was going out to see my girlfriend at the time, and my dad decided that he didn't want me to go. So an argument started, and in the midst of that argument, I told him to go to hell. And I remember he got up from the kitchen table with such force that the chair hit the wall behind him, and he came at me. And there were no blows exchanged. He didn't throw any punches or anything like that. But I kind of stood there ready to receive something. And I just remember a real disappointed look in his eyes. And I just was angry. So I walked out the door and I didn't come back. That started just a downward spiral into drugs and alcohol and bad relationships. And it wasn't long before that relationship ended, and the drugs and alcohol usage increased. I was hanging around people that was our mission. Our mission was to get the next high. And I had met another girl. We were invited to a party at a friend of hers house. So a friend of mine and I had gone and gotten some drugs and went to pick her up. We went by her friend's house and we began to party. And these were people that I had never met before. There was an older gentleman there who owned the home, and a very welcoming. And everyone was just having a good time, lots of laughs. Though my friend that I brought with me, he was not enjoying himself at all, and he was begging me to leave with him. And I didn't want to go. I was interested in the girl that had invited us to the party, so he left, and I was there alone with my girlfriend and these two guys that I had never met before, and we just continued to party, lots of drugs and alcohol. We were experimenting with LSD at the time, so we had lots of LSD, and I, relatively was having a good time. As the night went on, I was kind of exploring this house. So I was kind of moving away from, that small group of people, just kind of looking at the different pieces of artwork and things. And guy still had his home. I don't know what time of year it was, but I remember it wasn't close to Christmas, but Christmas tree was still up, and there were Christmas decorations and lots of artwork on the walls. So I was just, kind of in a museum, just, enjoying looking at all this new stuff. And as I am away from this group, I would hear every once in a while, I'd hear somebody call my name, and I would turn around and I would look at them and say, "Huh, what?" And they were all looking at me, and they'd look back at me and say, "Huh, what?" And as that happened time after time, I began to get a little freaked out, and I began to imagine that they were actually wanting to hurt me. So I got to a point where I ran out of the house with them chasing after me, and they were begging me to come back in the house. It was nighttime. It was in this neighborhood, and I just told them, I didn't want anything to do with that, and I got in my car and pulled out of the driveway and drove off. The next thing that I remember is waking up in my car in the middle of this neighborhood that I was unfamiliar with, and I just, because of the drugs, I couldn't even see past the windshield, and I could hear all the sounds of my car that was parked, but it was still running. I could hear everything, and I just remember, just kind of waking up in this stupor, and I heard this laughter coming from the back seat, and I looked in the rearview mirror, and the three of them were sitting in the back seat of the car. And I remember just getting so mad. I opened the door. I stepped out. I swung open the back door, and I screamed, "Get out!" And there was nobody there. I was hallucinating, and this was part of this trip that I was on. And at that moment, I came to the realization that I was dead. I had died, and here I am now, waiting to see what's next, waiting for heaven or hell. The drugs in that experience transported me to limbo. I was in a waiting place, waiting for whether I was going to heaven or hell. I was dead, and that was it. And here I am. And I remember just, gnashing my teeth and just walking back and forth in this neighborhood in the middle of the night. Again, imagining that I'm dead and I'm waiting, and I just am walking back and forth, and I'm hearing voices, I'm hearing laughter, and then I begin to imagine that these homes in this neighborhood are just facades, and behind each home are demons just waiting to pounce, waiting for me to get close enough for them to come and get me. And of course, this is horrifying. I'm here, and I'm in my own personal hell that I'm imagining because of this LSD. And at one point, I hear a noise, and I turn and I look, and I see what seemed to me to be this white, like low flying. The only way I could describe it is like a kind of a UFO coming down the road at me. And as it approached, it was making this strange noise, and I moved onto the lawn of one of these homes, and kind of was very close to to my back to the front of one of these houses as it drove by. And out of the window comes this loud fireball, and kind of just lands on the lawn in front of me. And later on, I realized that it was a white minivan, and it was a newspaper wrapped in plastic that was thrown out of the window. It was somebody delivering newspapers. But of course, I'm on this experience. Anyway, as I'm standing there in front of this house, I realized again that this house is just a facade, so I run back out to the road, and I began to kind of search my heart, I guess. Again, thinking about where am I going to go. I knew if there was a choice for me, whether it was heaven or hell, I was going to hell. I lived for myself. I was selfish. I didn't know God, and I just knew that my destiny at that moment was hell. And I remember hearing in my ear my voice as a child in Sunday school, singing "Jesus Loves Me," and with that realization, I started to cry out, and I said, "Yes, Jesus loves me. God, I don't want to go to hell. I want to be with you in heaven." And I had a thought at that moment that Jesus is the light. We hear that Jesus is the light, and I kind of repeated that to myself. Jesus is the light. And the only light at that time that I saw around me was coming from my car that was probably about 50 yards away. Engine still running, lights on. So I began to walk toward my car. And as I walked toward the car, I would hear laughter again and cackling, and I would turn my head to see where it was coming from. And when I turned my head back, I hadn't gotten any closer to my car. And I began walking toward my car again. and I would hear the noise again, and I would turn my head to look. And when I turned my head back, I hadn't gotten any closer to my car. And I remember at that moment thinking, okay, I need to keep my eye on the light. So I looked at the light, I walked toward it, and even though I heard the noise around me, I just kept my focus on the light and finally got to my car. But when I got to my car, I realized, okay, this is light. Here the lights are on, but this isn't the light. And at that very moment, I saw a light turn on in one of the houses that was closest to my car. So I walk up to the front door of this home. I knock on the door. And as soon as I knock on the door, I hear laughter again. And I turn around. And as soon as I turn around, this warmth hit my back. And I saw this kind of light come from behind me. And I turned around, and at the front door is a small guy, bald, glasses, wearing a bathrobe. And he asks me, "Can I help you?" And I said, yeah, I need help. And obviously I needed help. And he asked me what my name was. I had to pull out my ID from my pocket to remember my name. I couldn't even remember my name. I said, "Oh, my name is John." And I said, "What's your name?" And he said his name is Peter. And I just, all of a sudden, I'm like, "Oh my God, this is Peter." So I felt like I arrived at the pearly gates. And he asked me if he could move my car, so he moved my car into the driveway, invited me into his house. And this is really happening. This isn't a imagination here. I'm not hallucinating this. But at the same time, I'm still having this experience, and I can't tell, what's real from what's not. And he invites me in his home, and I remember it being warm and just, this beautiful house, artwork on the walls. And this woman walks out from the back room. And I asked Peter, I said, "Peter, is this your wife?" And he said, "No, this is my sister, Gabriel." And at that moment, I knew. I'm like, "Gabriel, this is heaven." He asked me if I wanted to use the phone. And I was thinking in my mind, I can do that from here? He asked me if I wanted to call anybody, and I'm kind of going in and out of the experience here, and so I thought to call my dad, and I barely remembered his phone number, and as I'm waiting for my dad to get there to pick me up, I was having a conversation with Gabriel, and she was playing a card game. And I asked her, what is she playing? And she said solitaire. And I remember thinking, and I asked, I said, it's a pretty lonely game, isn't it? And she said, well, it helps me think. And they gave me a cup of coffee. And it seemed like moments later, there were my parents at the door. My mom's got tears in her eyes, and my dad's got a smile on his face. And, what have you gotten yourself into? And on the way home, I remember, my dad was driving the car they came in, and my mom was driving the car that I drove. And I can't remember if I was in the car with my mom or my dad, but I just remember, exclaiming, "I'm going to start going back to church," and I'm throwing up on myself, but I'm at the same time filled with joy because I'm not dead, I'm not in hell, and I've got a second chance. And that started my journey toward God, because I didn't accept Jesus at that moment, at that time. I still didn't know God. I knew about God from growing up in church, but I didn't know Jesus. I didn't know God. And so I start going back to church, but my parents' church still wasn't doing it for me. I didn't understand. At that time, I had some friends that I used to work with that invited me to their church, and I thought all churches were the same. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and it was a pastor you couldn't understand, a pipe organ, and a choir, and hymns. But this church was different. It was people my age, and they had a band on stage, and the music was actually good, and I understood what the pastor was saying when he preached. And I remember shortly after going to that church, becoming a part of a singles group and realizing that these people had something that I didn't. They went to church. They seemed like church people. But they seemed normal at the same time. But they had something that I didn't have. And through meeting with them and going to that group and having a basic understanding of the scriptures from growing up, I was given a Bible tract, and it was called My Heart, Christ Home. And by the end of reading that little book, I remember in my room in tears by myself, getting down on my knees and asking Jesus to be my Lord and Savior, and praying a little prayer at the end. Part of it was, Lord, make me a man after your own heart. And that was over 31 years ago. And here I am, God's still making me into that man. It's been a lot of work for him, I'm sure. But that year, October 1994, I was on a singles retreat with that same group and was baptized in the ocean at Kill Devil Hills in North Carolina. And it has been a journey since then. God is still doing work. But that word that he shared with me the other day, that people need to hear what I have given you, or the people need to hear what God has given you. That's our testimony. That's what God has given us, the story that starts with accepting Jesus, and then at the same time we're able to go back before we ever knew him, before we ever even cared anything about God, before we accepted Jesus and realized that he's been with us the whole time, trying to turn us in the right direction, calling us to him, reaching into our experiences. In that case, it was this drug experience that really could have ended my life, and touching our hearts and reminding us of who we are and whose we are. God created us. He's the maker of the universe, and still he knows us by name. And there I did it. I shared what God has given me with you. And if you don't know him, you can. The invitation is there to know him. You don't have to have a drug experience to get there. Please do not. Learn from other people's mistakes. One of the reasons why I hesitated sharing my testimony many times is because I didn't want to glorify the drugs or show that was, some way to get to Jesus. No, it almost ended my life, and still has an effect to this day, probably in a negative way. But God did use it. Let him use your circumstances. Allow him to reach into your circumstances and get to know him and be known by him.